Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
Great. Because today we're tackling something uh, pretty massive, I'd say. We're going to be looking at the whole idea of God's love.
Yeah. That's one of those topics that seems simple on the surface, but the more you think about it.
And the deeper it gets.
Exactly.
So true. And our guide for this journey is, you guessed it, the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Study Guide. We're focusing on the first quarter of 2025, specifically Lesson 1,
Which is titled,
God Loves Freely.
yeah.
When I first saw that title, I'll be honest, I thought, okay, pretty straightforward. But then,
You started reading.
yeah. And whoa, this lesson raises some seriously thought-provoking questions.
It really does. Like, for instance, can God's love actually be rejected?
Ooh, good one. And if God is supposed to be all-loving, how do we explain all the suffering in the world?
Right. Tough stuff. But the study guide doesn't shy away from those hard questions.
Not at all. It jumps right in.
And one of the first things that struck me is how it emphasizes that God's love isn't just some kind of abstract feeling.
It's not just like a warm and fuzzy feeling.
No, it's way more than that. The guide presents it as an active, powerful force. It shapes, well, everything, really.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does the guide back that up?
Well, one of the key points is that God's love isn't something we earn. It's not a reward for good behavior.
It's not like be good and God will love you.
No, it's a free gift offered to everyone. No strings attached.
So our worthiness doesn't come into play.
Not when it comes to God's love, no. And that's where things start to get really interesting, I think. Because if God's love is truly free and totally unconditional,
Then that kind of throws a wrench into some of our traditional ideas about salvation, right?
right, it flips the script. It's like saying, hey, your value isn't based on what you do or don't do. You're loved simply because you exist.
Whoa. And that love, you're saying, it's not like a reaction to us being here.
Nope. The study guide actually points out that God's love predates creation itself. It was there from the very beginning, woven into the fabric of the universe.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that my existence, like my very being, was conceived in love before the universe even existed?
That's exactly what the guide is suggesting. Think about it. Revelation 4.11 tells us that God created everything for his pleasure.
Okay, I remember that verse.
And Psalm 73.6 says the heavens were made by the breath of his mouth. It's not like he needed to create, he chose to.
Out of love.
Out of pure, overflowing love.
Wow. That's mind-blowing.
Oh,
So you're
snap.
saying our very existence is like a testament to God's love. We were loved into being.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And that love wasn't just directed at humanity as a whole either. It was directed at you.
At me personally.
You were on God's mind, so to speak, even before the foundation of the world.
Okay, now that's starting to mess with my head a little bit. It's such a huge concept.
It is huge, and it changes everything about how we understand ourselves and our relationship with God.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. So if God's love is this like foundational, this all-encompassing force, what does that tell us about God's character?
That's a great question, and the guide uses some really interesting stories from the Bible to illustrate this point.
Oh, like what?
Well, one that stood out to me was the story of the golden calf. Remember that?
You mean when the Israelites, like right after they got out of Egypt, they built an idol and started worshiping it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, talk about a major fail. Fresh out of slavery, and that's the first thing they do. You'd think God would have just washed his hands of them right then and there.
Seriously. Like, okay, I'm done with you people.
Right, but that's not what happens at all. Instead, God, in this incredible act of mercy, chooses to continue the covenant.
He didn't give up on them.
Nope. He reaffirms his love for them, even though they just completely disobeyed him. Big
Wait.
time.
That's some serious grace right there. It's like saying, I still love you, even when you mess up epically.
It is, but it also brings up some tough questions. Like, if God is always willing to forgive, does that mean actions have no consequences?
And if God's love is really unconditional, how does that fit with the idea of justice?
Exactly. Those are hard questions to grapple with, but I think the guide offers some really insightful perspectives.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of insights?
Well, it points to a concept that's often misunderstood. The idea of God as the unrequited lover.
Ooh, that's a powerful image. And honestly, kind of heartbreaking.
It is. And to unpack this metaphor, the guide turns to the story of Hosea and his wife, Gomer.
Hosea the prophet.
That's the one. So God tells Hosea to marry Gomer, this woman who's known for being unfaithful.
So the relationship right from the get-go is marked by betrayal.
You got it. And Gomer's infidelity is meant to symbolize Israel's unfaithfulness to God. They kept turning away from him to worship other gods.
Over and over again. like a broken record.
Yep. But here's the thing. Just as Hosea continued to love Gomer, God continued to love Israel. He pursued them relentlessly.
So even though they didn't deserve it.
Exactly. God's love isn't passive, it's active, it's pursuing, even when it's rejected. And the guide uses this Hebrew word cheesed to describe this kind of love.
Cheesed.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds musical when you say it.
It's a beautiful word, isn't it?
Right.
And it carries this idea of steadfast love, loyal love, covenant love.
So it's not just a fleeting feeling.
No, it's unwavering, unbreakable, even when faced with betrayal.
So you're saying that's how God loves us, with this deep, abiding commitment that goes beyond anything we do, beyond our faithfulness even.
That's exactly what the guide is saying. It's a love that doesn't quit, a love that keeps on chasing after us even when we run away. And the guide makes it clear that this cheese love isn't just an Old Testament thing either.
It's in the New Testament.
It's woven all through it. Think about Jesus,
Okay, yeah.
the Son of God, leaving the perfection of heaven to come down to this mess.
To earth, you mean?
Yeah, to this world broken by sin and rebellion. He willingly steps into our messiness, our pain, all of it.
It's almost like he's saying, I love you so much that I'm willing to get down in the dirt with you, experience your pain firsthand.
To not just experience it, but ultimately take it upon himself on the cross.
The ultimate sacrifice. But maybe this is a dumb question, but if God's love is so powerful, why is there still so much suffering? If he really cares, why doesn't he just fix everything?
That's the question, isn't it? The big one. And honestly, it's a question that people have been wrestling with for, well, forever probably.
So no easy answers, huh?
Not really. But I do think the study guide gives us some clues, some things to consider. Like, it reminds us that God created us with free will.
Right, the ability to choose,
Yeah.
to love, to reject.
Exactly. And without that freedom, love wouldn't really be genuine, would it? God doesn't want robots who are programmed to love
He
him.
wants us to choose him freely.
Yeah. To respond to his love with our own love. But that freedom, well, it comes at a cost.
Because if we can choose to love God, we can also choose to turn away from him. And that has consequences, doesn't it, for ourselves and for others?
Absolutely. And the guide uses the parable of the wedding banquet to illustrate this. It's in Matthew 22. God throws this big party, invites everyone, but
Yeah.
a lot of people just choose not to come.
And even some of those who do show up, they're not exactly dressed for the occasion, right?
That's the point. It highlights another key aspect of God's love. It's not about performance. It's not about earning our way in. It's about accepting the invitation, just coming as we are, flaws and all.
That is a comforting thought, I gotta say. But it still doesn't quite answer the whole suffering thing. I mean, yeah, some suffering comes from bad choices, sure. But what about things like natural disasters? Or diseases that just, like, randomly strike people?
Those are tough ones, and I think it's important to just acknowledge that there are some things we simply don't have the answers to. But the guide, it reminds us that even in the midst of those tough things, even in the midst of suffering, God is present.
Okay, but how? How can he be present when things are so painful, so heartbreaking?
Well, think back to the story of Hosea. Remember, God, in his love, he actually identifies with our suffering. He experiences it right alongside us.
So, he's not some distant being just watching from afar.
Not at all. He's right there with us, weeping with those who weep, comforting those who mourn.
I like that image. But it's still so hard to square that with all the pain that goes unanswered in the world. I mean, if God is all-powerful, why doesn't he just step in, stop the suffering?
That's where we come back to this idea of free will. God gave us the freedom to choose, and sometimes those choices have really tough consequences. He could intervene, but that would mean overriding our free will, turning us into puppets instead of people.
So it's like a delicate balance, respecting our freedom, but still offering us his love and support.
Exactly. And the guide makes this point. God's love isn't just about rescuing us from suffering. It's also about transforming us through it.
Wait, so you're saying that suffering can actually be a good thing?
I'm saying it can be a catalyst for growth. Think about it. When we go through tough times, we're often forced to confront our own weaknesses, our limitations.
We have to rely on something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. And we learn to rely on God in a way we might not have otherwise. We develop compassion for others who are hurting.
So it's not that God causes the suffering. It's more that he can use it for our good, even when we can't see how.
That's a hard concept to grasp, especially when we're in the middle of pain. But the guide reminds us that God sees things differently than we do. He sees the big picture.
He knows the end from the beginning.
Yeah, and he promises that he'll work all things together for good, for those who love him.
That's a powerful promise. But it doesn't, like, magically make the suffering go away, does it?
Well, it doesn't, but it does give us hope. It tells us that we're not alone in our pain. God is with us every step of the way. And he's using our experiences, even the tough ones, to shape us, to mold us into the people he created us to be.
Man, this whole idea of God's love is so much more complex than I initially thought. It's not just about, like, warm fuzzies. It's about wrestling with tough questions, confronting the reality of suffering, and trusting that God's working things out even when we can't see it.
I think you've got it. And I think the guide does a great job of challenging us to think deeply about these things, to grapple with the tension between God's love and, well, just the reality of our human experience.
Okay, so we've talked about God's love as this foundational force, this cheese, this unwavering pursuing love, and we've talked about the whole suffering thing. What else does the guide highlight about God's love?
Well, there's one thing that's both profound and, I think, really practical. It's the connection between God's love and our love for others.
Okay, so how does that work? We've been talking about receiving God's love, but how does that then translate into us loving other people?
The guide presents it less as a translation and more like an overflow. When we truly experience God's love, it's like this wellspring inside us that naturally spills over into our relationships with others.
So the more we experience God's love, the more we're able to love others.
That's the idea. It's not about trying to force ourselves to be more loving. It's about letting God's love flow through us, transforming us, making us more like him.
That makes sense. But it also sounds kind of idealistic, I gotta say. I mean, we live in a world where love is often conditional, people hurt each other, relationships are messy.
It's true. Trying to live out God's love in a broken world, yeah, that's a challenge, but it's not impossible. And the guide actually gives some practical suggestions for how we can do it.
Ooh, I like practical. Give me some examples.
Okay, well, it talks about the importance of forgiveness, for starters, choosing to let go of bitterness and resentment.
Extending grace to others, just like God extended grace to us.
Exactly. But I gotta say, that's definitely easier said than done. I mean, some hurts, they go deep. Some offenses, they just feel unforgivable. It's true. Forgiveness, it's a process. And it doesn't mean pretending that the wrong didn't happen. It's about releasing the bitterness, the anger, that stuff that just poisons our own hearts.
So it's about choosing to love, even when it's hard, even when it hurts.
That's it. And the guide is clear. This kind of love isn't just an emotion. It's a choice we make every day, in big ways and small ways, choosing to act in ways that are selfless, compassionate, kind.
So it's not just about feeling warm and fuzzy towards people.
Yeah.
It's about putting that love into action.
Right. It's about showing up for people, listening to them, offering support, meeting their needs.
And that can look really different depending on the situation, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about practical help, like, I don't know, cooking a meal for a friend who's sick. Other times it's just about being present, being a listening ear.
Exactly. And even small acts of kindness, they can make a huge difference. A smile, a kind word, a genuine expression of concern, those things can mean the world to someone.
So it's not about having to do these grand gestures. It's about those everyday moments, the ordinary interactions.
And when we start doing that, something amazing happens. We start to reflect God's love to the world around us. We become tangible expressions of his grace and mercy.
I love that. But it kind of makes me wonder, if we're reflecting God's love, does that mean we have to be perfect? Because, newsflash, I'm not.
None of us are. And that's the good news, right? God's love doesn't depend on our perfection. It's a free gift. It's there for us, flaws and all.
So it's not about pretending to have it all together. It's about being authentic, admitting our weaknesses.
Yeah.
And letting God's grace do its thing.
Yes. And the guide reminds us that God often uses the most unlikely people to accomplish his purposes. He takes our brokenness, our imperfections, and somehow he transforms them into something beautiful.
Like that Japanese art, kintsugi, where they repair broken pottery with gold. The cracks actually become part of the beauty.
I love that analogy. God does the same thing with us. He takes our broken pieces, our shattered dreams, even our past mistakes, and he uses them to create something new, something stronger, something more beautiful than we could ever imagined.
Okay, so we've talked about how God's love transforms our lives, how it overflows into our relationships with others, and even how it redeems our brokenness. But I'm curious about something. We've been talking about the personal stuff, but what about the bigger picture? Does God's love have, like, societal implications?
That's a great question. And it's something the study guide touches on in a really profound way. It suggests that God's love isn't meant to be contained, like kept within the walls of a church or just within our personal
So
circle.
it's not just a private matter.
No way. God's love, it has this social dimension. It should shape how we interact with the world around us, how we engage with issues of justice and equality, how we care for those who are marginalized,
It
oppressed.
sounds a lot like what people call social justice. Is that what the guide's advocating for?
It's not about advocating for a specific political stance. It's more about recognizing that God's love has implications for how we live in community, how we treat those who are different from us, how we use our resources to make the world a better place.
So it's not about picking sides in political debates. It's about letting God's love be the driving force behind how we act in the world.
Exactly. And the guide reminds us that Jesus, he was the ultimate example of this. He reached out to the outcasts, challenged the religious leaders, spoke truth to power.
He didn't shy away from tough issues. He faced them head on, but always motivated by compassion and this desire to see people set free.
And the guide challenges us to do the same, to let God's love shape our priorities, our values, our actions, to be agents of reconciliation, bridge builders, peacemakers.
That's a tall order, but it's also really inspiring. It gives us a purpose, a reason to get out of bed and engage with the world in a way that matters.
It does, and it reminds us that God's love isn't just some nice idea. It's a powerful force, and it has the potential to transform not just our own lives, but the whole world around us.
That is a powerful thought. And it brings us back to that question from the beginning. If God's love is really this deep and free, how should that change the way we live?
Yeah.
How we treat others?
It's a question each of us needs to wrestle with, I think, on a personal level. But the study guide, it definitely points us in the right direction. Like, it shows us the example of Jesus.
Who really embodied God's love in such a radical way.
Exactly. And it challenges us to let go of our selfishness, to embrace a love that's selfless, sacrificial, and ultimately life-changing. And it reminds us God's love isn't just a destination. It's a journey, a process of growth and transformation that happens day by day, moment by moment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how foundational God's love is, the whole cheese thing, the challenge of suffering, how love overflows into our relationships, and even the social implications. What else from the study guide do you think is essential to highlight?
There's one more thing, and it really ties everything together. The idea that God's love is ultimately about restoration.
Restoration. What do you mean by that?
Well, sin, at its core, it's a broken relationship. It's turning away from God,
Right.
rejecting his love. And we see the consequences of that brokenness everywhere. Pain, suffering, injustice, division.
So you're saying God's love is about healing those broken relationships.
Exactly. Bringing us back into a right relationship with him and with each other. Restoring wholeness, both individually and collectively.
And how does that happen?
The guide points us to the cross as the ultimate symbol of God's restorative love. In Christ's sacrifice, we see just how far God is willing to go to reconcile us to himself.
So it's not just forgiveness, it's about making things right, restoring what was broken.
Exactly. And that restoration, it's not just a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. It's about letting God's love work in us, to heal our wounds, to transform our hearts, to make us more like him.
And as we're transformed, we become agents of restoration in the world, right? Bringing healing to those broken relationships,
Yeah.
working for justice and equality, extending compassion and mercy to those who are hurting.
It's a beautiful cycle. God's love flows into us, transforms us, and then it flows back out, touching and transforming the world.
That's a powerful image. It gives me hope. It reminds me that even though the world is full of brokenness, God's love is still at work, still healing, still restoring.
It is. And we get to be part of that work, to be instruments of his love, agents of restoration.
Okay, so we've really gone deep in this deep dive. We've explored the depths of God's love, wrestled with tough questions, and discovered the transformative power of his grace. If you had to pick just one key takeaway for our listener, what would it be?
I think it's this. God's love, it's more than just a feeling. It's a reality. It shapes everything. It's the foundation of our existence, the source of our hope, and the power that transforms us from the inside out.
It's a love that's freely given, relentlessly pursuing, and ultimately restorative.
And it's a love that invites us to be a part of it, to become channels of his grace in a world that desperately needs it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave our listener with a final thought to chew on.
Go for it.
If God's love is truly as transformative as we've been talking about, what's one small step you can take today to let that love flow through you, to let it touch the world around you?
That is a great question. And I encourage everyone listening to really sit with that, because the truth is, God's love isn't just meant to be studied, it's meant to be lived.
And as we live it out, we become part of something so much bigger than ourselves. We become part of God's story of redemption. And that story is still being written, a story that each of us is invited to play a part in.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into God's love.
It's been a great conversation.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
It really is amazing to think about that we get to be a part of something so much bigger than ourselves. And speaking of being a part of something, there's one more piece from this study guide that I wanted to touch on. It kind of connects this big universe-spanning love to something very down to earth, the sanctuary. Ah, yes. The guide does some pretty cool things with the sanctuary system, uses it like a lens to help us understand God's love.
I'll admit, at first I was like, okay, here comes the part about all the rituals and laws.
I get that.
But it went so much deeper.
That's the thing about the sanctuary, right? It's easy to get caught up in the details, but the guide really emphasizes that it wasn't just about rules.
It wasn't.
It was about God's desire to be with his people, to actually dwell among them.
It's like he's saying, I love you so much, I want to be near you, even though, you're kind of a mess.
That's a good way to put it. And remember that Hebrew word nedabah we talked about earlier? The idea of giving freely, voluntarily.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, that concept pops up here too. The guide points out that God didn't have to offer us a way back to him.
He chose to.
Out of love. Purely out of love.
And the guide really drives that point home by connecting the sacrifices in the sanctuary to Jesus.
To the ultimate sacrifice on the cross. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
Yeah. It's incredible when you think about it that way. Like, the whole sanctuary system was pointing forward to Christ.
It's like this foreshadowing woven into the fabric of their worship.
And it just shows how much God was willing to do, to invest, to restore our relationship with him.
It's a love that doesn't make sense to our human minds. A love that's willing to suffer, to die, so that we can live.
And is offered freely. No strings attached. We don't do anything to earn it.
Not a thing.
I've got to say, I've read about the sanctuary before, but I never really connected it to God's love like this.
It's amazing what happens when you take the time to really dig deep, isn't it?
It really is. So I guess that brings us full circle. We've gone through this whole study guide, unpacked some pretty big ideas, but I keep coming back to that question it asks. If God's love is truly this deep, this free, how should it change the way we live?
That's a question that deserves some serious thought. It's not something you can just answer off the top of your head.
It's easy to talk about God's love. Living it out, that's a different story.
Oh, yeah. Totally different. And I don't think it's about suddenly becoming perfect, never messing up again.
So what is it about?
It's about letting God's love be the compass that points us in the right direction. It's the thing that guides our decisions, big and small.
So like choosing to be kind, even when we're frustrated, or forgiving someone who's hurt us, maybe speaking up against injustice when we see it.
All of that. It's about letting God's love be the fuel, the motivation behind our actions, not just some nice idea we think about on Sundays.
Well, folks, there you have it, our deep dive into God Loves Freely. From the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Study Guide, we've covered a lot of ground, from ancient Hebrew words to the sanctuary system and everything in between.
It's been a wild ride, but honestly, we've just scratched the surface. There's always more to discover.
That's the beauty of it, right? But the real journey, it starts now. As you take what we've talked about and let it shape your understanding of God's love.
And hey, maybe this deep dive will inspire you to do some exploring of your own.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.